cold evening here in Brighton, England. But it's an absolute delight to join you today in what should be hopefully a very rewarding webinar on slavery in Louisiana and indeed in the Caribbean. As Ashley said, my name is Richard Follett, and I've been writing about the history of slavery and emancipation in Louisiana for the best part of the last 20 years. And over that time, I've had the great opportunity to work with Whitney Plantation on various different occasions, and with community groups in South Louisiana and with other heritage sites throughout the state. So it's really very, very good to be back. And thank you so much for inviting me today. I'm going to now share, hopefully, my screen and provide some visual images instead of looking at me. So let me just do that right now. I think that should be working. Is everybody clear? Good. I see a couple of nods. I first became interested in the history of slavery in Louisiana sugar parishes when I was a graduate student doing my PhD back at LSU. Well, back then, apart from a book published in the 1950s called Sugar Country, there was really no modern, comprehensive history of sugar slavery in the United States. 20 years on, and thanks to the books by myself, Rebecca Scott, John Rodriguez, Moon Ho Jung, Anne Malone, and several others, we now understand a lot more about the lived experience of slavery and emancipation. We understand more about the business operations of the plantations along the river parishes. And as you can see on the map here, this gives an indication from 1860 of the main areas of production in South Louisiana. And we understand much better, following this body of scholarship, the ways that the enslaved people and their descendants fought to secure their agency, their dignity, and improved conditions. At Whitney, of course, that work continues. The Memorial Garden to the 1811 Louisiana Slave Revolt provides vivid and moving testimony to the 500 or so enslaved men and women who rose in rebellion against the unspeakable horrors of racial slavery, only to be cut down by federal troops at the outskirts of New Orleans. By 1812, when Louisiana entered the Union, the state was at the very forefront of the plantation revolution. Sugarcane, as many of you know, was a climatically forced crop in Louisiana. And for most of the 19th century, just as today, in fact, production was concentrated in the southeast and south central parts of Louisiana. But there, a vast plantation complex emerged, with slavery, of course, at its core. The number of sugar estates grew from just 200, so a relatively small number, in 1824 to over 1,500 by mid-century. And with it, the enslaved population grew as well, from some 20,000 enslaved people working on sugar estates in the mid-1820s to some 125,000 by the middle of the 19th century. Sugar production ramped up, and in 1861, enslaved people produced 250,000 tons of sugar. It was enough to supply half of America's US domestic demand, but it's not a touch on what Louisiana produces and manufacture today, roughly 1.4, 1.5 million tons of sugar out of Louisiana in a current context. But in many respects, Louisiana was among the last of the New World sugar colonies. And in many respects, it bore much greater similarity to the Caribbean than to the Cotton South. Big plantations were the norm, as were large African-American majorities, particularly in the river parishes. On average, large sugar planters owned about 110 enslaved people. They had roughly 1,600 acres of land, and they generally produced somewhere between 500 and 600,000 pounds of sugar by the late 1850s. Now, just to give you a point of reference, most enslaved people across the Cotton South lived in communities with approximately 22, 23 other slaves. That's the norm in cotton, but the norm in sugar is about 4 to 5 times larger in scale and operations. In South Louisiana, as the opulence of the plantation houses reflect up and down River Road, sugar, of course, created vast wealth and plantations that dwarfed all but the largest estates anywhere in the American South. And with the introduction of steam-powered mills to speed up production and maximize yields, Louisiana Sugar soon became the most capital-rich agricultural region in America. But of course, it was ultimately the sweated labor of the enslaved that ultimately drove production. And indeed, unlike most parts of the US South, where an almost equal number of enslaved men and women lived and worked, in the sugar parishes, the demography was very different. It was 60-40, 70-30 in favor of men, and very much young men as well. And for decades, sugar planters favored these young men and young male laborers, and they returned year on year to the auction houses in New Orleans to purchase young men, particularly in their early 20s. Organized, as the slide suggests, into labor gangs and under strict surveillance, enslaved people labored in tandem, undertaking specific and often gender-specific tasks. Violence was hardwired into slavery, with the whip frequently applied for any discretion, real or imagined. As one Louisiana slaveholder put it, and I'll quote him, "A plantation might be considered a piece of machinery. To operate successfully, all of its parts should be uniform and exact, and the impelling force regular and steady. And the master," he menacingly wrote, "should be the impelling force." Well, Cecile George, an African-American woman, put it more bluntly, reflecting back on slavery in the 1930s. And she wrote, "I come up in hard times, slavery times. Everybody worked, young and old. Sunday, Monday, it's all the same. It was like a heathen part of the country." Well, like Cecile George, the enslaved woman Maria survived sugar slavery. And as we shall see, she successfully made the transition to free labor in the 1870s and 1880s. Born in Virginia in 1829, Maria was, like so many enslaved people in Louisiana, sold into the domestic slave trade and forcibly separated from her family in the Upper South. In 1859, aged 30, her name appears on an estate inventory appears on an estate inventory as the legal property of James C. Woods, along with her 4 children, aged 6, 4, 2, and an infant. She was a single mother, living in West Baton Rouge Parish. In April 1862, as the Union Army neared, and that's slide there, as the Union Army neared, thousands of enslaved people fled to the Union Army colors, seeking protection in the army camps near New Orleans. Others, like Maria, took the opportunity to break free, and under the terms of the labor system in Union-occupied sugar parishes, she was paid wages. Slaveholders were desperate to keep hold of their crews, and they offered competitive wages. It was a beginning, a nascent labor market, which Maria deployed, exerting her right to contract where she chose by moving jobs for better wages and better terms. The Freedmen's Bureau captured her record, and here she is at the very top here in the red pen, captured her record. She only made $6 a month as a second tier, as will most women, I'm afraid to say, cane hands. It was the going rate. It's only about $180 in today's money. Well, 5 years later, Maria reemerges, still single, aged 40, but this time with 6 children. And in 1879, she becomes a landholder, paying $160 cash and 3 promissory notes for a plot of land not far from the old James Woods plantation. Less than 2% of farm owners in the state were African Americans, and an even smaller number were women. Aged 50, Maria Woods was listed on the deeds, and Maria Woods, as she was listed on the deeds, had made her freedom real, her independence secure, and her children's future secure in the 19th century sugar country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Follett. And we are going to move now to, who did I say? Rebecca Scott or Vereen Shepard? Okay, we're going to go to Rebecca Scott next. Oh, Professor Shepard, you are sharing your screen. Hang on. We're moving to, okay, there we go. All right, Professor Scott, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So good morning, and thank you to the staff at the Whitney Plantation and Ashley in particular for this opportunity. And thanks to everyone who's logged on for this discussion. It's nice to see that we have 83 people who are engaged in this conversation. So it's a great privilege for historians to have an opportunity to share their research findings with people in the area that they study, people who live in the area that they study, and to learn from you what the questions and issues are that are most pressing in your own explorations of the history of Louisiana. So we're particularly looking forward to the 20 minutes of question and answers that we'll have time for at the end. I'd like to suggest just 2 observations about the history of slavery in Louisiana and the Caribbean, and then use those as a jumping off point when we move toward a moderated discussion among all 3 of the historians. So my first observation builds in some ways on the remarks just made by Richard Follett in his discussion of Maria Woods. I've become persuaded that the uncovering of life histories of named individuals can be one of the strongest tools for combining the professional study of history and the broader public participation in and understanding of historical interpretations and the way that they develop over time. So for example, next semester, I'm teaching a seminar at the University of Michigan Law School that's titled Slavery and the Law, Reopening a Cold Case. And in that class, each student will reopen a single cold case. They will dig into a specific legal record to narrate and analyze the dynamics of the interaction between individuals and the law in the context of slavery. Now, I can help students frame their inquiry by presenting some of the historical scholarship on this topic, including many of the books that Richard Follett mentioned, as well as the ones he's written. But it's the researchers themselves, it's the student researchers themselves who will engage the question by transcribing records and thinking through one person or one family's encounter with the law, whether as fugitives from slavery or defendants in a criminal case or plaintiffs in a freedom suit or whatever other form of engagement we see in the records. And it's possible to do this in part because Louisiana's legal records concerning slavery are exceptionally detailed and voluminous. And cases that were appealed to the state Supreme Court are now digitized and freely downloadable from the website of the Historical Archives of the Supreme Court of Louisiana, which are held at the University of New Orleans and are in their library. So as Whitney Plantation's Memorial Garden demonstrates, which Richard Follett mentioned, providing individual names, and in the case of Whitney Plantation, they've also used ones from Gwendolyn Midlow Hall's remarkable database. Providing individual names helps us begin to see the lives lived by those who carried those names and makes it possible to link documents from different sources, as Professor Follett has just done, so that the stories take on particular weight and meaning. So So that's a first framing observation about the kinds of things that we can do collectively. So on the specific topic of Louisiana's connections with the Caribbean, Richard Follett's pointed out that the structure of sugar plantations in Louisiana more closely resembled their counterparts in Cuba or Jamaica rather than the cotton farms of much of the US South. And here again, Louisiana is quite distinctive. In addition to the structural parallels with the forms of coercion and injury and capital accumulation entailed by those parallels and by those plantation structures, there were also thousands, literally thousands, of direct connections between Louisiana and the Caribbean, particularly between Louisiana and the Spanish colony of Cuba and the French colony of Saint-Domingue, later the independent nation of Haiti, and to a somewhat lesser extent with Jamaica. And in some cases, it's only by following family histories that we realize where the Jamaican connection lies, and it has to do sometimes with the movement of refugees. So many of you who have been reading Louisiana history and reading the materials available at Whitney Plantation are undoubtedly familiar with the large-scale arrival of refugee migrants from the Caribbean to Louisiana in 1809. This was a very large-scale arrival, nearly 10,000 people who arrived in New Orleans over the short space of one summer, practically doubling the population of the city for the time that they were there. Most of them were women, children, men, Black and white, who had left Saint-Domingue, Haiti during the Haitian Revolution, generally in 1803, during the moment when the French government, the Napoleonic regime, had sent an expeditionary force to try to crush the movement led by Toussaint Louverture to capture Toussaint Louverture and to attempt to roll back the revolution that had taken place. This was an unsuccessful attempt by the French expeditionary force, but in the process of attempting it, they created a world of war and fire from which many people sought to escape. And then with the somewhat chaotic evacuation of French troops, further people tried to exit the colony, quite unsure of what would come next in the aftermath of the war. So they had generally left Saint-Domingue in 1803. They had found asylum in Cuba. They had again, some 10 to 15,000 people had found asylum in Cuba, and many of them remained there for 6 years and were then expelled from Cuba as France and Spain went to war in 1808. Again, Napoleon, it's the movement of Napoleonic troops across the Pyrenees and into Spain, and then the resistance to his presence in Spain that puts Spain and France into conflict. And this creates a situation in which, from the point of view of Cuban colonial authorities, the refugees from Saint-Domingue who are living in the Spanish colony of Cuba now appear to be people from an enemy nation and therefore potentially unwelcome aliens. And they are expelled peremptorily in 1809. Now, and many of them board the ships that are in the harbors in Cuba, and the majority of them proceed to Louisiana. So what I'd like to suggest here, and this is on the direct point of connections between the Caribbean and Louisiana, I'd like to suggest a corrective to the way that that migration is usually described. And it's a corrective that comes from two things. One, from having read again and again in many documents the phrase Saint-Domingue refugees or Haitian refugees and their slaves, or the phrase a group that included enslaved people from Saint-Domingue. Now, it was through tracing individual life histories that I became aware of how incorrect that characterization is. And in a sense, the error, which is repeated by professional historians and by many other people, it arises from the success of a maneuver and a manipulation to attempt to transform the status of those people. And it was successful both in terms of the enslavement of individuals and in terms of leaving a mistaken historical impression of what had happened. So what I'll do with my last moment or two here is to suggest something from that movement of refugees. because otherwise the misunderstanding conceals a key point about the relationship between law and slavery and between the Caribbean and Louisiana. Slavery had been abolished in French Saint-Domingue in 1793-94 in the course of the Haitian Revolution, both de facto, through self-emancipation, through revolutionary policy, and under law issued by French civil commissioners and by the French National Convention. The effects of that legal abolition then extended across portions of the colony that had been occupied for a period of time by the English, as Toussaint Louverture's forces expelled the British occupiers in 1798. Why is this relevant? That means that from 1798 onward, no one living in Saint-Domingue was legally enslaved. That means that no one who left Saint-Domingue as a refugee headed for Cuba in 1803 was legally enslaved at the time of their departure. In other words, there were no slaves in Saint-Domingue at the moment of departure of this group of refugees. However, many of the propertied people among Saint-Domingue refugees sought to take advantage of the transition from one jurisdiction to another to impose slave status on free people among them. In other words, they rather hoped that the effect of abolition could be dissolved in the course of crossing the Windward Passage to Cuba. They would treat French-Haitian abolition as if it were what they called a legal nullity, that is to say, something that had no meaning, and would therefore try to claim persons once again as property, not even necessarily the same persons whom they had once before under Ancien Régime, pre-revolutionary law, been able to claim as property. Once they reached the slaveholding jurisdiction of Cuba, they hoped that they could exercise custody over the most vulnerable among the refugees of African descent, and that such custody would be read as possession in the way that one would possess property rather than a person, and that possession would be read as ownership. In other words, they hoped that they could transform free persons into property. And as the refugees prepared for their second journey, the most confident among them drafted a petition to try to persuade the US government to let them repeat that sleight of hand and multiply its consequences. US federal law held that it was strictly unlawful to bring anyone into the United States from abroad to be held as a slave. That's the famous 1807-1808 law, often referred to as the abolition of the slave trade. It is not the abolition of the slave trade. It is the illegalization on paper of the bringing of persons from abroad to be held or sold as slaves. They drafted a petition. They sent it to the president. The president passed it on to Congress. What they hoped to do was to claim 3,000 women, children, and men on the boats. First, they claimed them as their domestiques, that is to say, their domestics, leaving a kind of ambiguity as to their status in order to slip in under the 1807 law, in other words, to violate federal law. And then they fully intended to claim them as slaves as soon as they had slipped in. So the result was multiple. 3,000 acts of what I would call peremptory enslavement, that is to say, enslavement outside of law, but bringing legal consequences, claiming free persons as property without legal process. And that in the context also of this massive violation of the 1808 federal law. Both of these were carried out with complete impunity. President Madison signed individual documents lifting penalties for any possible prosecution for violation of the 1807 law. So this rethinking of Caribbean connections, which I've suggested here, has really emerged as we trace individual life histories. It was as I followed the path of a child named Sanit, who had been born free in Saint-Domingue. She was offered up as collateral for a mortgage in New Orleans in 1811, and then offered up for sale. Or the life history of Adélaïde Métayer, whose son was seized and sold at auction in payment for a debt in 1810, even as she was living as a free woman of color. So one of the things I hope for from today's collaboration at Whitney Plantation is a further uncovering of stories like these. I think through them, We can rethink the history of slavery in Louisiana and the connections to the Caribbean. And at the same time, we will catch a fleeting glimpse of what each of these meant in the lives of individuals. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Scott. That was really interesting. And I have questions I'm going to ask at the end based on that. Whitney Plantation also does have record of some people who were enslaved at the property there who came from both Jamaica and from Saint-Domingue. And our research director is actually here today. He might be able to tell us a little bit more about that. But as many people in the audience know, there are large connections, huge connections between Saint-Domingue and Louisiana. And there's a kind of thing that people talk about all the time about all these refugees who came here. So that's a really interesting corrective that you've just offered. So we're going to move on to our last panelist, Dr. Vereen Shepherd. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen, we will move on to you.
Thank you so much. So we had a false start before, so let's see if we now have our screen. Thank you so much. We do have our screen now, our PowerPoint. So greetings, everyone. Happy to be part of this e-conversation. My thanks to Ashley Rogers and her staff at the Whitney Plantation for the invitation to be here. And greetings to everyone who is sharing this Saturday with us. Now, let me say from the beginning that unlike Rebecca and Richard, I am not at all a specialist in the history of Louisiana. My specific contribution today will be to show the ways in which the Jamaican economy and society during the period of African enslavement departed from the strict application of the sugar plantation economy model, even in parishes that looked like Louisiana after 1803 to 1812. Of course, in its early beginnings as a colonial space, Jamaica would have patterned Louisiana as a diversified economy. Nevertheless, despite the persistence of the plantation economy model, which stresses the role of the sugar plantation with its white elite sugar planters in structuring Caribbean society along a rigid enslaver-enslaved dichotomy, diversification was a significant feature of Caribbean economy. So European colonialism did not succeed completely in introducing structural discontinuities by appropriating the land resources of the region for its monopolistic sugar plantation designs. There is no doubt about the primacy of sugar though. From its arrival on the European market, sugar yielded a far higher and steadier profit than any other product exported from the Caribbean. Sugarcane cultivation far outpaced other agricultural and economic activities and gave rise to levels of wealth and conspicuous consumption that eventually elevated the sugar planting elite above other sectors. But in Jamaica, not only did those other sectors not disappear entirely after the expansion of the sugar sector, but in the case of properties called pens or livestock farms, the main focus of this intervention today, the rise of sugar plantations facilitated the expansion of the livestock sector. The need of the sugar plantations for animal power to drive the mills not only facilitated a thriving internal trade in animals and sometimes in other products produced on the pens, but a trade in animals between pens and plantations in the island, but also led to trading relationships with non-British territories in the Spanish Caribbean, in Cuba, for example. So this economic relationship ran counter to the economic rationale for colonies under mercantilism. So we established that the sugarcane had emerged as the most profitable crop in Jamaica by the last quarter of the 17th century. By the mid-18th century, the island was firmly established as a major producer in the British Empire. From a mere 57 sugar plantations in 1670, the island had 246 in 1685 and 340 by 1740, with the parish of Clarendon alone having 66. For most of the 18th century, Jamaica was Britain's leading sugar exporter, and in the 1770s surpassed all other British colonies combined. And you can see here this dominance reflected in the distribution of proprietors across the island. Production more than quadrupled between the 1720s and 1770s, and aggregate levels of capital investment increased markedly. Between 1740 and 1790, sugar plantations spread rapidly along the north coast and on the western plains in response to the buoyancy of the sugar market and the availability of enslaved labor. And these images have been taken from my book, Livestock, Sugar, and Slavery. And I'm using them just to illustrate some of the trends I'm talking about. The development of a plantation economy dominated by the production of sugar for export created an extraordinary demand in Jamaica for livestock. And you can see the way in which livestock has spread across the island by 1740. This was because before the development of chemical fertilizers and until draught animals were largely displaced by motor transport, sugar plantations relied heavily on animals for a variety of draught and other purposes, including mills. The need was greatest in the sugar parishes of St. Thomas in the east, Trelawney, Hanover, St. James, St. Mary, Westmoreland, Clarendon, St. Thomas in the Vale, and Vere, that together in 1789 accounted for 542 or 76.34% of the 710 sugar plantations in the island. As sugar plantations proliferated after 1680, the demand for livestock to provide all of the above functions increased. And as the demand for cattle, horses, and mules grew, so did the efforts to establish local breeding farms. By the outbreak of the American War of Independence in 1776, Jamaica was already being described as an island of large sugar plantations and cattle farms. By 1782, there were 300 pens in the island. By 1804, plantations were as dense in the northern and western coastal plains as on the more extensive southern lowlands on which the estates had rapidly pushed out pens and animal mills had proliferated. And we can see the distribution of mill types by county by 1804. Between 1800 and 1820, specialized agricultural areas had developed. Though pens were still widely distributed, they became generally restricted to certain parishes on the north coast and in the western part of the island. By 1832, sugar had 49.5% of the enslaved population, coffee 14.4%, and livestock farms or pens 12.8%. Pen keeping thus developed both as an aid to diversification and a prop for the sugar economy, helping to reinforce its dominance. The non-sugar producers, while fairly influential in the pre-sugar era, soon lost their political power to the sugar barons. Nevertheless, the contest over space and socioeconomic and political influence and status continued to characterize the relationship between sugar barons and non-sugar producers. So what of the enslaved population on pens versus on plantations? The project of studying differentiation in slave systems is now quite advanced. Scholars have subjected enslaved people's experiences to rigorous caste, class, color, gender, and ethnic analyses. Such investigations of the plurality of experiences is no longer located only within the context of the sugar plantations, like it was when I did my PhD way back in 1988. Occupational diversity has been given some attention. The objective is to interrupt and subvert the other process of homogenization that has occurred in slave studies and to emphasize the multiple economic environments in which enslaved people's productive capacities were revealed at times within the same territory. Of course, it is undeniable that the majority of the enslaved in the British colonized region experienced slavery on the sugar plantations, where they were the backbone of the first and second gangs, which did the most arduous work in the fields on the plantations, producing for the export market. Indeed, in all the British colonized territories which produced exportable quantities of sugar, with the exception of Jamaica, over 80% of the enslaved workers were on sugar estates by the 19th century. In fact, as Barry Higman's quantitative work has demonstrated, the percentage of the enslaved engaged in sugar range from 60 to 90%, in the British colonized Caribbean. In St. Kitts Nevis, Antigua, and Montserrat, few enslaved people were occupied other than in sugar cultivation. It wasn't that extreme in Jamaica. For the enslaved population, the daily and annual routine of life on the non-sugar properties might have been different from those on sugar plantations, where life was harsh, brutish, and short. The enslaved population smaller in size. For example, Simon Taylor believed that for a pen with 600 head of cattle, a labor force of 50 workers was adequate. The average size of the labor force on pens in Jamaica was somewhat higher than this, approximating 98 or 100. Many were Creole from other properties traded internally. Supervision was not as tight. Pens, for example, were legally required to maintain a white presence in the ratio of 1 to every 30 and 150 head of livestock. The pace of work was less frantic, with labor routines involving no intense periods of work comparable to harvest time on the sugar plantations, no peaks and troughs, no long night work or night hours like those which the enslaved on the sugar plantation had to endure, especially during the manufacturing period. It was generally believed that where the enslaved were not engaged in the production of sugar, their chances of survival were greater. Their diet was a little better, and so were the opportunities for production of self and the internal markets. But let me stress that there was a sameness in terms of the gender division of labor, with women predominating in field work. There was a sameness in terms of the sexist ideology. There was a sameness in the ideology of white supremacy. Pro-slavery ideology manifested in slave control mechanisms demonstrated a striking unifying tendency, regardless of the economic context of slavery and the class position or economic status of the enslaver. Similarly, anti-slavery activities were as marked on non-sugar properties as on sugar plantations, exploding the myth that material conditions and differences in slave regimes bore a relationship to the enslaved's passion to resist. Despite the differences in the work culture, the conditions of enslavement were such that whether on sugar plantations or not, the enslaved people's passion to resist remained similar, even if their strategies demonstrated variations. In other words, the contest over terrain, however defined, also characterized the relationship between the pen owners, the pen keepers, and those they enslaved. Finally, we see the names of pen slaves in the punishment list after major wars of resistance, and like the 1831-32 Emancipation War led by Samuel Sharp. So we know that they too were flogged, dismembered, raped, deported, and hanged. Richard Trail and Thomas Horton, belonging to Shetlandwood Plantation, mustered a large body of enslaved people by Horton Grove Cattle Pen. A good many Negroes from Ramble Pen, all men, that's a quotation. A great many from Alexandria, all men, nearly the whole of Silver Grove men. Richard Trail had a gun and Thomas Horton a large Bible. The enslaved people were drawn up in a line which extended from Horton Grove Cattle Pen to the farm. Thomas Horton administered an oath for each man on the Bible that they would fight against the white people as long as there was one of them left in the country. So that quotation is from the testimonies of those tried and punished for their role in the 1831-32 Emancipation War in Jamaica. The consequence? Richard Trail from Shetlandwood, Thomas Horton from Shetlandwood, Henry James from Burnt Ground, Charles James from Beverly, and Robert from Summerhill were all executed. Eugene Genovese is thus basically correct when he asserts that, and I quote, enslavement in any form has figured as the antithesis of that individual autonomy considered the essence of freedom, end of quote. So the revolt against slavery emerged as the basic assertion of human dignity, and clearly resistance was as likely to result from rising expectations and indulgence as from brutal treatment and poor material conditions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shepard, for that. I really appreciate that. And if anybody has any questions, just a reminder, you can go ahead and put those in the Q&A, and we're going to save those for later. But we are going to move on to a facilitated conversation. So I want our scholars to kind of talk and find connections between these presentations that they've given. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Scott for that.
Thank you. So this is enormously interesting, and I think in some ways, Ashley Rogers' quiet comment that Whitney Plantation contains records of migrants from Jamaica and from Saint-Domingue is something that intrigues all three of us. If we were doing this physically at Whitney Plantation, we would already put in a request to see if you could bring them downstairs by lunchtime. So, but doing this on Zoom, in effect, we have to project some things we would like to do in archives, some of which we can't. So what I'd like to propose as a first question has to do with sources and archives, and particularly sources and archives in the context of collaborative research. I think this is something that all three of us and the folks at Whitney Plantation as well are familiar with. And so I'd like to really ask both Vereen Shepard and Richard Follett, what are the kinds of ways that you can see for us to benefit from the combined energies of professional historians, students, and lay researchers to fill out and develop the kinds of life histories that each of us have been drawing upon? I think as I listened to the talks, it seemed to me that the minute we give a name and a face, and this was very vivid in what Vereen Shepard was just saying, the minute that we give a name and we can envision a moment, the quality of our own attention and understanding begin to change. So do you have examples of bodies of data located in archives, perhaps in disparate archives, that are really beyond what any one individual can do, but that might be made particularly rich? We might be able to get the documents to speak, in effect, if there's collaborative effort. I know many people have probably seen the recently opened database that's located, set of databases that's located at enslaved.org, which connects to a whole set of sources, including the long existing Gwendolyn Midlow Hall database taken from largely Louisiana notarial and legal records. But what are the kinds of things that you've come across or learned about in your own research in which you'd like to sort of open out for other people to join in? And I have one in my mind, in my pocket, that I'll mention when the two of you finish, but I thought I would open this out to both of you. Maybe I'll just start in the order in which you spoke and ask Richard if there are particular kinds of Louisiana archival sources that you'd like to see folks ranging from fellow professional historians, graduate students, undergraduates, lay researchers, museum and archive staff, that you'd like to see them dig into and maybe in some cases digitize in order to make them more widely available. Did you have some thoughts on this, Richard?
Thanks very much indeed, Rebecca. About a decade ago, I was involved in a major collaborative project for 5 years on digitizing a huge body of records relating to Louisiana. And they were the sugar returns done on an annual basis by Pierre Champommier and Louis Bouchereau. We digitized them, and then we produced a search engine and all of those good things. And throughout that period of work, both as an academic, but also working with students and with colleagues in Louisiana, it proved to be a really rewarding space to create and co-create a body of information around the nature of Louisiana sugar. But I think there's a bigger piece that is really now available, because in the last 5 years, definitely in the last 5 years, we've seen an incredible acceleration in digital technologies. And the amount of material that is available, particularly in US history and the history of African-American enslaved and then emancipated peoples, has grown exponentially. And I think that there are two areas particularly. One, the Southern Claims Commission case files. Now, for many historians, those are very familiar to us, but those were places that formerly enslaved people went after the Civil War to make legal claim on property that they had lost. And this opens up this whole space of people like Maria, who had property, and not in her case, because she got it after the war, but property that was all owned, property that was shared, and indeed records surrounding individual case histories. When genealogists and members of the public who are interested in history start to delve into those claims, and moreover into the Freedmen's Bureau records, and into the census records, and into the notarial records, you can begin to piece together stories. Often they'll run short. They'll just run out of information, unfortunately. It's not necessarily sequential in that way. But when we begin to piece together, we'll begin to create more and more of those life stories that add yet further dimension, color, context to the kinds of work that all of us have been involved in.
So that's a very interesting example. And of course, for our listeners, Dylan Penningroth wrote a famous book in which he drew called The Claims of Kinfolk, very closely on the Southern Claims Commission. So it's people who are making claims for property that in many cases was commandeered by Union armies as they moved into the South. And what Penningroth points out is that this was property that enslaved people believed themselves to own, despite the fact that under the logics of slavery, as persons who were owned, anything that they had custody over belonged to their master. And one of the things that's become clear is that the Claims Commission, when it was set up, did not expect to get claims of that kind. It expected to get claims from white people who had stayed loyal to the Union. But it came as a surprise to them that persons who'd been formerly claimed as slaves would come forward, state their Unionist sympathies, document their Unionist behavior, pro-Union behavior, and then explain what the wagon was or the bags of corn that had been taken and what date and by what officer. They are extraordinarily rich records. And as you say, both for developing life histories and for looking at the process of testimony, because people had to back up each other's claims. And so you get multiple voices. You're not just focused on those 3 bags of corn. You're hearing who knows whom and who will say what about whom. So I found my law students find these particularly interesting because they have the proceedings have a kind of legal form. Vereen, I expect that every historian has in the back of their mind documents they opened and they thought, my God, a lifetime isn't enough. Can't we recruit some other people to do this and create some voices, and maybe particularly related to your work on reparations? Is there something you'd like to pitch in as a data source you'd like to make sure that the 81 people who were listening all know about? And any graduate students who are looking for dissertation topics and projects? Yep.
Well, thank you. I have, over the years, been looking for the voices of enslaved people. And I know that there's a large body of research on voices, but they're not as readily available as people think, especially for the Caribbean. They exist as figures. So many traded, so many were on the plantations. So for the past 10 or so years, I've been looking for testimonies. And so, of course, in Jamaica, we have to make that trek to the National Archives in the UK to find a lot more records because they're not here. They have been taken away. So I have been looking at the testimonies after each war in Jamaica, and those are the ones I've been tracking down. So I'm very attracted to a body of records called, the reference is CO137/185. I know it by heart because those records, they capture the punishment of enslaved people, but the fact is that they have the names. So now we have names of enslaved people, their ages, in some cases, whether they were African or Creole, the gender, and the punishment they got. But apart from that, there's another associated body of records in that same set of records in the National Archives. with the testimonies. So when people were tried for their role in the war, so Samuel Sharp, the leader, was tried. Other enslaved people had to give evidence. So those multiple voices are very interesting. Many historians have written about this war, but statistics, 76% were hanged, 26% were shot. But where are the names and where are the voices? I think that's very interesting, and my students are finding those records very interesting. Then everybody knows about the compensation records at University College London. That's an amazing set of records. And finally, the upgraded slavevoyages.org of Eltis and his colleagues, the 2018 set of records, now with names of captured Africans. And is studying and getting accustomed to the names, how to pronounce them, and so on. So there are multiple sets of records that are being thrown up, because I want to know that they are more than what Vincent Brown, refers to as numbered notations. We want to have voices, we want to have names, we want to have experiences.
So this is exciting, because I think and for our listeners, and we'll turn to questions from our listeners in just a second, but I'll also drop my sort of piece in, and it picks right up on what Vereen was just saying. With one of my graduate students, Lucas Kutsuka Shalubi, who's a Brazilian graduate student, we've recently been working on the record of Africans who were aboard one of the ships which was seized and prosecuted under the 1808 law. And there is one ship for which we have a list with African names, age, and gender of each of the captives aboard. And it came into New Orleans. Now, I suspect many of the 77 people who are listening to us here know that in the notarial archives, you can trace individual transactions. It's not easy, but because the sale of the captives aboard that ship led to the creation of a list with the name of the captive and the purchaser, it means that through the purchaser's name, it is possible to track the resale. And with the name of the individual captive, it will be possible to see how the African name was replaced in many cases by a European name in the process of transmission of persons as property. So these were all people who were unlawfully brought into the United States, but the enforcement of the 1807-1808 law did not entail the freeing of persons aboard those ships. Technically, the captain could be punished, the boat could be seized, but the captives were to be sold in the New Orleans slave market under Louisiana law. So I'm hoping that people who enjoy working in the notarial archives might be willing to work with us and see if we can reconstruct the population that was aboard the ship, the Josefa Segunda. So again, people should, I think, feel free to get in touch if they'd like to know more about these projects. Now, I can see that the Q&A list is building up, and I can also see that our ending time is going to come in 15 minutes. So Ashley Rogers, if you don't mind, I had 2 more questions for our moderated discussion, but I'm eager to know what people are asking in the chat line. So can we switch now to taking some questions from our participants? Is that okay?
Yes, let's go ahead and do that. And I wanted to, let's go ahead and get Dr. Cote Roberts' question in here. He's a professor at LSU as well, and he's asking for you, Dr. Scott, is the implication of your corrective that Black Haitians were free and departed for Cuba and the US of their own accord only to be enslaved there?
So that's a good question. Pleased to have Cote Roberts posing it. The answer is complex. Historians always say that to you. They'll always tell you that the answer is complex. And I'd be happy also to correspond offline about this as we go forward. But briefly, in a situation of warfare, particularly women who had young children, I think took steps, made choices that were consistent with trying to flee a war zone. And so rather than seeing them as leaving the prospect of freedom in Haiti for the prospect of enslavement in Cuba, which is what it might look like, as Vereen was saying, if we were just looking at numbers, or if we were just thinking of it from 30,000 feet up. But if you imagine yourself as a mother with a babe in arms, and the fire is literally coming down from the hills, and there is a schooner in the harbor, and it will take some people aboard. This, and I'm speaking now of the particular experience of a woman named Rosalie de Nation Poulard, an African-born woman who clambered onto a boat on the beach in Les Abricots in exactly that setting, with literally fire coming down toward the water's edge. And so I think we should use words like of their own accord or chose to leave quite cautiously when we're talking about a wartime exodus. Also, so there were people who, of course, had no way of knowing what the aftermath of war would be. I mean, this is always true. And they also had no way of knowing what Cuba might hold. They had no way of knowing where they might end up. And others were, and this gets to Vereen's point, others were expelled in some cases by, for example, the British who were occupying a few forts on the North Coast. They simply put Black people onto ships and sent them to Baracoa in Cuba because they viewed them as unnecessary mouths to feed. So I think it's a complex question. There isn't a single answer, but I would stick by the claim that these people were free under law at the moment that they departed as wartime refugees. In some cases in Cuba, they were then transformed legally into the status of slaves. And other times they simply stayed within households, and what we might think of as the peremptory enslavement took place in Louisiana. So I don't want to monologue on this question, but it's a great question. Ashley, you want to pose one? I know there are some for our other speakers.
Yes, and I'm going to get Dr. Seck. Dr. Seck, our Director of Research at the Whitney Plantation, is asking some questions in here for our panelists. So I'm going to get his question for Dr. Shepherd in here. Do Jamaican archives mention the origins of enslaved Africans?
Not all the records. I think the best account of origins comes from the slavevoyages.org 2.0 database, because those captured are actually the names. It's not names, it's the origin, where were these people taken from, the ages. And I think something that makes me really upset from the database is the number of children under 12, 1 year old, 2 year olds, 3 year olds. And then the number of old people. What are you scraping up a 66-year-old woman to take to the Caribbean for? To be enslaved, And I saw a question in the chat about whether the names help in terms of reparation. Absolutely, because they place people in Africa. And these are people who are going to be shipped here. And the other records, where the ships are actually arrived, we know the captain, we know the flags flown, we know the origins, and so it's further justification for our fight for repatriatory justice.
Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in that are difficult to get to. But we have had several questions about reparations, and Dr. Shepherd, I know that you are a specialist in studying that in Jamaica, and I wonder if you might just be able to speak for just a moment about what your work looks like in Jamaica around reparations, and maybe we can help to kind of address some of these questions that people have.
Yes, so what I did was to collapse some of the answers based on the questions I was looking at in the chat. So people were interested in origins, in names, in what that says about repatriatory justice. But right now, I think we have a lot of information. The shipping data has given us about 12 countries that were involved. So it's not the usual ones that we know about: Spain, Britain, USA, the Dutch. We have a wide variety of countries now that we have managed to get from this updated database. So CARICOM, the heads of government, have put together a commission called the CARICOM Reparation Commission. It's chaired by the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles. I'm one of the vice chairs. And we have national committees right across the region. And so that's the structure. We have a 10-point action plan for repatriatory justice, which starts with an apology and goes right down to debt cancellation. So it's an active movement. And the evidence is piling up. We have, I think, enough evidence, and it's just for us to structure our claim and to build an army of people who understand that the transatlantic trafficking was wrong. Right now we're talking about the Zong this week and all those atrocities. And we know we have a good claim. So it's just to ensure that Europeans know. And I know in the United States is a big movement as well. And I mentioned the trade in Africans by USA to Jamaica and the other parts of the Caribbean directly, not just passing through here on its way to Cuba or to the United States, because I know there's a view that Caribbean people in the United States are not entitled to reparation. They are, because the USA traffic people here to the Caribbean. And I think some scholars are saying that after major wars of resistance in the British colonized Caribbean too, that some were sent to the plantation south. So we have a connection, and so we have a movement together.
Thank you so much. I'm going to kick a couple questions to Professor Follett based on your presentation. So we had one asking if there was any record of the holdings of Maria Wood's land in the present day and whether it remained in her family. And maybe also I'm going to combine that with another question about whether there is any more information about the group of people of African descent with the 2 women holding babies that you showed. And if you can just give any more context about that.
Thanks very much, Ashley. And I think the question touches on what we've just heard about tracing connections and the importance of tracing connections, be that for reparatory justice or indeed for recovering personal histories, which is where we started. And I think to come back to some of the observations we heard earlier, the opportunities now for members of the public to engage in that conversation are unprecedented. They're certainly better than we had only a matter of years ago because of the volume of materials online. In terms of the Maria Wood's connection, that particular line runs out. But Maria's daughter, Catherine, also purchased land about 2 years after Maria did, right next to her. And that family line through Catherine and her marriage to a man by the name Moses Jackson can be traced more accurately through the historical record. So while Maria's, if you like, line runs a little cold, the ultimately other directions, and that is ultimately, as I'm sure Vereen and Rebecca would reflect, is exactly what history is required. Sometimes you will run short on one point, but another avenue will open up. And in terms of the photographs, I'm afraid those photographic records that we have that date back to the 1860s and 1870s and early 1880s are often just photographs that are unnamed and they are present within manuscript collections. Tracing back those kinds of face-to-name identities is extraordinarily tricky. But it is, with the more work that we put in to finding and tracing connections, the more likely we are to be able to make some of those connections stick. And just to pick up on Vereen's point about reparatory justice, and I think it's crucial that it's, as some of you will be aware, debates and indeed student protests and street protests have culminated in the last 4 to 5 months, both in the US and around the world, over claims over reparatory justice. And I think one of the jobs that universities need to be doing and are doing is unpicking their own institutional histories that are connected through to the Atlantic slave trade, or for that matter, investments that they make. And that's something that is going ahead, albeit perhaps too slowly.
Ashley, if I could add on, just a footnote to that. I think on one of the points that really links what Richard Follett is saying and what Vereen Shepherd has been saying, Vereen, you mentioned that sort of shock one feels in the archives sometimes when you see something on the page. You were saying this about who grabbed that 66-year-old woman and why, right? And I had a similar kind of archival shock when studying a kidnapping case from Pointe Coupée, Louisiana, case of Eulalie Olivo. She was in her 60s and she was kidnapped by a gang along with 6 of her children and 11 of her grandchildren. And I realized that although the legal case that ensued, from which I'd found this, was in the name of Eulalie Olivo, that what the kidnappers were really doing is they were manifesting that concept of heritable enslavement. If they could prove falsely, if they could prove somehow that Eulalie Olivo was a slave in their language, if they could make what they had done seem to be legal, then through the principles of heritable enslavement, they would be able to sell as property those sons and daughters and grandchildren. So in a sense, the value to the enslavers of trying to prove this falsehood, this big lie that Eulalie herself was a slave, was illuminated the whole logic of heritable slavery. So I share with you that sense that we're collecting documents, but also we have to be prepared to be shocked ourselves as we work in the archives. Ashley, I'll turn it back to you for if there's time for one last question. Yeah.
We have several meaty questions in here and that we're not going to have time to get into. So I want to thank everybody because we are running up against our time limit here. I'm going to open too big of a question here, but someone answered a question or asked a question. Can you make the connection between American and Caribbean enslavement to today's mass incarceration? And I think that might be a bit too much for us to take on at this moment, but if anybody has any parting thoughts that you might be able to give our participants a little connection there, I would very much appreciate it.
Yeah. Richard.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and it's one that I'm writing a book about right now. So I'm writing a book which is on the history of all the rebellions and plots and insurrections and whatnot led by enslaved people from the 17th century through to the Civil War in the US. And it's the first big book on this kind of project since the 1940s. Comprehensive book on it, at least. Now, the narrative to it, Ashley, is exactly what your questioner asked, which is how does the criminal justice system in the United States, as it responds through to these various incidents of enslaved insurrection and the like, how do they begin to create a narrative, a political narrative, a racialized narrative that leaves young African-American men perpetually trapped within at the heart of the criminal justice system, both over insurrection or for feared insurrection and the like. And so the thrust of the book is trying to look at the way in which young African-American men became historically criminalized over time. And the consequences of that, I'm afraid, I'm not trying to link what happens today to what happened then. There are lots of factors changing things in the 19th and 20th centuries. But to understand the historic pattern of criminalization, to understand some of the very topics that we're tackling with today in terms of racial justice, requires us to understand how that metric, if you like, how that narrative was constructed amongst white authorities. And the point being that if it dates back to the 17th century, it suggests that it's deeply woven, and the challenges of unweaving it become, of course, equally significant and important.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that one before we wrap things up here?
If I could just say quickly that there's no doubt that there is a connection between the ideology from the era of enslavement to now. The law was used to criminalize the actions, resistant activities. And so even today we're seeing still on the books laws that are designed to oppress, especially young Black men. And not to mention the conditions in the prison system, which in some of the former colonies resembles a slavery. And so the law was used to oppress. The fear factor was used to make punishment extreme. And so we have not rid ourselves of some of those ideologies. Last point I want to make is about this theory of distant. Richard sort of made a suggestion about the past and today. The theory of distant is being used sometimes to create this space between what happened then and what happened now, especially for the reparation movement. But we know that in 2015 is when the UK paid off the loan that was taken out to pay planter compensation, that Black people in the UK helped to pay off this loan through their taxes, and that people benefited from the inheritance. So it's not too far in the past, which is being used as something to defeat the reparation movement. It is right with us. We're living with the legacies, and we're living with the legacies of underdevelopment, and others are living with the legacy of enrichment. So it's not too far at all in the past.
Thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap this up. For everybody who is still with us, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm sorry we had a couple questions we didn't have time to get to, but we're trying to respect everyone's time on a Saturday morning, afternoon. Who knows what's going on? Several people have asked if we are going to have this recording available, and we will. I'm going to get with our Director of Communications, Joy Banner, and we will be distributing that. We'll let everyone know next week, likely on YouTube. We'll put out the link. Also, as we're leaving, I do have a quick 5-question survey for the audience. So if you do want to answer that question, it would be very, very helpful. We are planning to do several more events like this next year, and would love your input about topics that you'd like to see covered and any scholars that you'd like to hear from. So thank you all so much, and thank you so much to our panelists for bringing all of your knowledge and sharing that with us and with our audience today. It's so important. So everyone, take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.